Welcome to NAS Dialogues, the dialogue podcast focused on events and issues in school psychology. I'm Dan Florell, the NASP Online Communication Coordinator and moderator of our current dialogue. Today we're discussing crisis intervention in a time of social media. We're going to have Steve Brock with us. He's the program director at Sacramento State University. So, Steve, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Dan.
And let's start off and just talk about how social media has changed the crisis response, because you've been in this long enough to know pre-app.
Are you saying I'm old?
Well, I'm going to say you're a very grizzled veteran, but
I
no,
am
never
a grizzled
old.
veteran. And because of that, from that perspective, I'm able to state quite unequivocally that social media has quite literally been a game changer when it comes to mental health crisis intervention. Going back to my early career when I started as a school psychologist in the 1990s, schools had time. When something happened, say in the course of a school day, school had time to kind of get their act together. You know, the principal could write a letter. You send it home with kids at the end of school.
You meet with the faculty.
You meet with faculty, and you had time. It began to change, and the first time I noticed this for real was after the Columbine shooting. It began to change when we went from, evening, sometimes morning newscast to a 24/7 news cycle. The 24/7 news cycle changed it because now, and what I noticed after Columbine, I remember I had young children at the time. I got up probably at 3 a.m. doing something with a kiddo and turned on the TV, and there's CNN. It's at 3 a.m., and there's a group of kids from Columbine sitting in a circle talking about a school shooting. And then it hit me, wait a minute, this isn't something that is dosed anymore. This is now literally being broadcast across the country 24/7. So that changed it. And then with the advent of social media, what we now find are circumstances wherein schools have literally no time to get their act together. If they're not prepared to respond to a crisis in a coordinated way, they're in trouble, because there's a good chance with today's use of social media that the school community will know about some sort of traumatizing circumstance simultaneously, if not before the school knows about it.
Right.
So, the time to get your act together, so to speak, and respond to a crisis is over. Social media, quite literally, has been a game changer.
What would you say the implications then have been as far as school preparation, crisis intervention preparation, because of this closed period that they used to have time to formulate a response after the event to now being real-time, streamed? What do schools do? I guess really the only thing is, how do they get in a preventative stance for when a school crisis occurs? Not hoping that there isn't one, but when it does, do they have to have, what would you recommend they have in place to anticipate that you're going to have basically the whole community on your doorstep that may even know more about an incident than you do?
Well, and also in this day and age, and again, as a grizzled veteran, I can look back to a period in time where school mental health crisis intervention was something new, and it wasn't something that everybody expected. Now, the school community, the consumers of our services, expect us to respond professionally and to respond immediately. What I think this means, and to get back to what I think is the premise of your question, is that schools must continuously be involved in an ongoing cycle, hopefully most of the time, of prevention efforts, and then to a lesser extent, but again, continuously, preparedness efforts, so that when they need to respond and move into recovery, they don't have to spend time getting their act together, so to speak. Everything needs to be in place immediately. So it's a constant year-round cycle. You need to have a standing crisis response committee in your school and your school district that meets regularly, and hopefully is spending most of their time talking about how we prevent crises, and they're successful doing so. But that committee needs to appreciate even the best of crisis prevention efforts isn't going to stop all critical incidents from occurring. And so you need to be prepared, and you need to, on an ongoing basis, talk about what we're going to do to be ready to respond. And social media can be a tool that we make use of in that regard.
I think it's a really good point because you talk about the era of the, dusting off the folder for the crisis intervention plan. And
Yep, that's over.
That's way over, and being able to think about that.
Yeah, it's not something you do at the beginning of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And then you sign people their roles, and then, okay, we're done. Our plan is in place. That time is over.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also curious, and it goes a little bit away. Well, it may get into some of the things that we're going to talk about anyway, but some of the dangers. But I'm kind of curious as to what might happen if you do have all these traumatic kind of experiences that are almost going off live, unfiltered. Are you seeing in your experience now a kind of almost a contagion of community trauma? So it happens in one high school, but you have students in other high schools that may be somewhat close to, or even more remotely. So, I'm thinking of the incidents in Parkland would be the one that's, garnered a lot of media attention. What's your experience there? So, I mean, in theory, you could even have a district not even happen in your district and have to have some sort of crisis response to something that happened elsewhere.
Yeah. And I think, as you alluded to, we're kind of getting into some of the dangers of social media. Because of social media, kids around the country literally could be exposed 24/7 to the Parkland shooting. They would pick up their phone and they could go to a social media app, Twitter, Facebook, and have reports, sometimes in real time, about what's going on half a country or thousands of miles away. And that's going to be problematic for adults. But adults know, okay, this is really stressing me out. I've reached the point where the information is no longer helpful, and I need to turn the phone off, turn off the TV. It's stressing me out.
Right.
The child, the teenager, to a certain extent, but especially the child, isn't going to have that adult capacity to sort of self-monitor and appreciate, okay, this is too much. And so, yeah, it can generate trauma. That's one of the dangers, I think, of social media, is its potential to generate trauma.
Well, I'm thinking about, the basis of cognitive behavioral treatment and the recurrent thoughts, and now you have almost an electronic enhanced version of that is the antithesis, of course, to that technique, which is to get a repetitive thought cycle, a loop, and that continually view it. I show my own age, so we're just not picking on you, but, we think about like 9/11, which, some of our listeners probably weren't all that old for, but the TV kept looping on that day to the scenes of, crashing into the World Trade Center, and that eventually, they said, look, you're basically traumatizing people who are glued to the TV watching this over and over again. You need to stop playing the loop.
Right.
But at that time, a network could control. Now, there is no filter. And
and they did. I mean, when we were watching that, I remember that day. It's one of those flashbulb memories, I think, that we'll all carry with us. I remember clear as day watching the live coverage.
Right.
And some of the images that were displayed on my TV when it was live, the people jumping, was horribly traumatic, and that's burned in my memory like you can't. Well, I'm sure you can imagine, actually.
Very well, yeah.
But when you're talking about the loop, the responsible news outlet, when they looped back, I didn't see that.
No.
And that was good, and that was appreciated, and that's responsible. Social media doesn't have that filter. And so what we will have is, once that's out there, it will be looped with all of the traumatizing scenes and images. It won't be sanitized in any way whatsoever.
Right.
And that's one of the dangers of social media. I mean, we get this instantaneous flow of information, which is helpful. And by the way, people have come to expect.
Right.
That's one of the challenges for schools today. And kind of getting back to some of our initial conversation.
Sure.
The idea that you just can't wait because the school community isn't going to wait, and they're going to get their information somewhere.
Well, so we talked a little bit about dangers, and I'm sure we'll get back to more of them. But, we don't want to be the social media bashers necessarily. It is part of our society, and there's certainly some advantages that come with any tool, just like the disadvantages. So what can we see as maybe some of the opportunities that social media can provide in regards to school crisis response? I mean, I'm picturing off the top of my head, we certainly have an avenue to get out our information to more people in a quicker manner than we ever could before.
Yeah, yeah. And we need to, because people are expecting it
Right.
quicker than they ever did before. Facebook, Twitter, there's plenty of examples already of situations where organizations have made use of Twitter and Facebook to, in a real timely fashion, give community members up-to-date information that were provided, guidance that was very helpful and very adaptive. Following the great earthquake in Japan, I think it was 2011.
Was that the Fukushima?
Yeah, yeah, the Fukushima, where the nuclear power plant had the meltdown. The U.S. Embassy, because cell phone towers were damaged, they were still able to get out tweets. And the U.S. Embassy was able to give people guidance, powerful, important guidance on what to do to cope with the aftermath of a really serious natural disaster.
One of the things that I kind of wonder, though, and I don't use either of these platforms very much, but I know that the bulk of adolescents tend to favor more Instagram and Snapchat, which are not built as quite public social venues like Twitter and Facebook. And so have you noticed some issues with that where like they may be able to loop into some of the information, but then like school officials may have a more difficult time getting information because that's what the kids tend to use and not so much, the movement has certainly been away from Facebook, and I don't know that adolescents have really ever embraced Twitter all that much. So I'm curious if you're knowledgeable about any incidences with those kind of platforms.
Yeah, and it gets back to the whole idea of dangers and opportunities. Those kinds of social media platforms can, to a certain extent, be helpful in that they increase connectedness to others. What helps most people get through difficult times isn't a mental health professional. What helps most people cope with traumatizing crisis situations are moms, dads, teachers, and friends. And to the extent those apps facilitate connectedness to others that they wouldn't otherwise get via face-to-face interaction, it can be helpful. It can be a powerful tool. That's one of the things about these apps that they do is they give us kind of a window into how teenagers and young adults help each other because it's documented and you can look at it.
Right.
You can see, like, for example, as people are replying to posts or comments, you can see the advice, the comments, and what you see. I mean, this isn't rocket science. This isn't brain surgery. Helping people get through difficult times a lot of times is just being there.
Right.
Lending emotional and sometimes physical support. It's real practical kind of stuff. And when you look at the posts, a lot of times you see these teenagers, they're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah.
Of helping each other. So it can be an opportunity and it can be a resource. On the other hand, not all of these posts are positive, and this is where you get into cyberbullying. Cyberbullying, unlike the more traditional forms of physical aggression that boys might engage in at school or when they're out in the community, cyberbullying goes with you everywhere.
Right.
You can't really escape it. Back in the day before social media, and you're bullied, you go home.
Right.
And you hopefully have a loving, supportive, caregivers in your home, and it's safe and secure. And for at least that period of time, you didn't have to worry about it. And as bad as the bullying might be, you could go home and it was done. Can't do that with social media and cyberbullying.
Well, and I'm even thinking with crisis intervention, even though people might think that's horrible, how could anybody do it? Especially if you have a trauma that's later, you could even you could see taunts of people that they've targeted, you're next, or, why are you crying? Nobody likes you anyway. and other sorts of things that you could see possibly also going on, as well as the social supports, which I'm also kind of curious as to whether those virtual social supports are as helpful, or at what level are they helpful compared to the physical in-person kind of, like, would I react the same way that I get lots of hugs and thumbs up from whatever platform that I'm using, compared to somebody actually coming up to me and physically supporting me and being there? Is it tap into this idea of that we long have had of a perceptual, like, do we perceive that we are being socially supported versus maybe actual social support? And so it's kind of an interesting question to ask that we maybe haven't really considered as much in the past.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. As far as the cyberbullying, though, do you see incidents of that in your own postvention crisis intervention work, where you do see people who are responding to things that are beyond, or just
it
not?
happens,
Yeah.
but it's relatively rare within the context of a thread wherein kids are talking to each other about a traumatizing circumstance. Again, most of the time what you're seeing are helpful, pro-social comments and posts. It does happen, where there might be some cyberbullying within that context, but just from my experience, speaking anecdotally, cyberbullying is kind of a separate entity, not necessarily tagged on to the crisis. It can be a cause of the crisis.
Sure.
That's one of the dangers of social media is, the possibility of generating real significant distress.
I always refer to social media as the magnifier, and it magnifies the good and the bad, and makes it more intense. So you have, if the lens is turned towards the bad, you get cyberbullying, and it can be very intense, which you've had bullying in the past. And just like you've had traumatic events in the past, it can also be brought to the good and incredible, touching stories of support and such that can be rallied. And, we see with some of the ones that have made the major media outlets, people reaching out from around the country to help out, or, send things, and the goodwill that generates to many extents.
But the flip side of that coin, as we were talking about before, was the trauma generated, miles and miles away from the scene of a traumatic event.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, do you eventually, due to the repeated exposure, become more immune? Do you find that maybe...
No.
You don't? Okay.
No.
All right. See, this is why I asked the questions. Well, because, of course, the evidence on school violence, for example, and you witness lots of violence on TV and your social media and stuff, that you have somewhat of a blunted response if you actually see violence occurring. But in your experience, that there's just nothing, no matter how many times you view it in an artificial sense, that when you see the real thing, that it still has the same type of traumatic impact?
There is the phenomenon known as post-traumatic growth. But the relationship, to the extent that having an experience, either virtually or in reality, can be positive, the relationship's curvilinear. In other words, there's only so much that you can take, and then it starts to have really significant negative consequences. The tolerable stressor becomes the toxic stressor.
Okay.
At a certain point.
Kind of a dose-dependent sort of phenomenon.
Yeah.
I mean...
In a curvilinear fashion.
It goes a little farther afield than our social media, but, it makes me think about virtual reality and the way that it's able to mimic real life. And, of course, video games and more violent content. As that violent content becomes more immersive, do we anticipate either the blunted response, or that people could almost self-traumatize? Say a child at 5 or 6 takes an adult-rated video game, but it's a virtual reality one that, has a lot of the thoughts and panicky kind of things. I'm just more spitballing and curious.
It would have to do with, because really what makes something traumatic is how it's viewed.
Right.
and the same two people experiencing the exact same trauma will view it as having different degrees of threat.
Mm-hmm.
So really what makes something traumatic is how the individual interprets it.
Right.
Now, there are certain variables we know feed into the perception, including, most obviously, the directness of the exposure.
Mm-hmm.
But it all has to do with how they view it.
Right. And so if you go in viewing it as a game,
Yeah.
you're not going to have the same experience as I'm not expecting this, and this is, I'm cornered by it kind of thing, I would imagine.
And in addition to proximity, physical and emotional closeness,
Mm-hmm.
Pre-existing personal vulnerabilities have a lot to do with it. So,
Sure.
The game scenario that you're talking about where a kiddo gets hold of some incredibly gory, adult-oriented virtual reality simulation,
Mm-hmm.
To the extent they have a trauma history or they don't have a good baseline health or they're isolated and alone and there's really nobody they can talk to about what they've just been exposed to, that will also play into how they perceive it and will serve to make, for some, the experience more threatening.
Now, so given that, and knowing that, a lot of kids have quite a bit of traumatic experiences in their schools, would you recommend a social media blackout for those kids, or is that denying them the social support too? And are you tapping into if they tell me I'm not or shouldn't, then I'm absolutely going to?
Yeah. And this is something I'm sure that you would agree with, given your experience with technology and social media. And the time where we could tell kids just stop or ban them from social media has passed.
Mm-hmm.
What I think we as educators need to do a much better job is education and training.
Right.
We need to do a much better job and be way more deliberate about telling kids the advantages of the tool, social media, and also the disadvantages and the dangers. Talking to them about, it's not good for you to watch a traumatizing thing over and over and over and over again. Here's how it affects you.
Right.
There's a point at which you know what you need to know. Your questions have been answered, and now you need to put it down. Also, how to more critically evaluate social media. That's one thing that I learned from the last election cycle.
Oh, sure.
In particular, was we need to, in education, do a much better job of creating a generation that not just uses social media, but uses it smartly, uses it well. We need to create a generation of critical consumers of social media and the content that comes over social media.
Well, I think it does, in stark relief, really point out the ability of needing to understand that everything occurs within a context and that a 20-second video is very hard to place context. I'm thinking about, we had a recent incident out in Washington, D.C. From a Catholic school from my beloved state of Kentucky and a Native American, and there was this kind of standoff, and everybody jumped on the Catholic boys that were there and their behavior. And then when you saw a longer form video, there was a whole third actor that was in play that never got the first round. And so, if anything, that was the eye-opener on needing to be critical. And the first question should be, okay, this is a moment in time, but the moment in time, there's no context. We don't see the build-up. We don't see the after effect. We just see that little bit.
Yeah.
And then, of course, adults leap to conclusions just as much as the
Right.
kids. So it's almost
Yeah.
don't do this. It's almost a cautionary tale
Right.
when we talk about that social media. So I think it's a real
But
good
as
point.
adults, I think we should hold ourselves to a higher standard. We can make mistakes,
Yes.
but we should learn from them quickly, and then we should pass that knowledge on.
The problem is that nobody pays attention to the ones that do that, right? It's the loudmouths. It's the people that want to be the first ones on and cry out their indignation on whatever event it is, and then jump to those conclusions.
Yeah.
You know, going all the way back to the wonderful 24-hour news cycle, but now you also have the Twitter cycle, which is even more than 24 hours,
Yeah.
it seems like, and makes it that much more of a challenge.
That situation you're talking about. This was the kid with the
The-
Make America Great hat
Yes.
on and being confronted on.
It's
in front of
smiling.
Was it
at
the Lincoln Memorial that they
It
were in
was.
front of?
And-
Yeah. Okay. That social media post shaped perceptions. Now, it wasn't necessarily traumatic, but it certainly created coping challenges for all of us as we
Sure.
thought, oh my gosh, what's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
The perception wasn't reality. It created coping challenges. And I can see similar things happening with more traumatic images.
Oh, sure.
Where, the thing about the 24/7 news cycle is at least they were professional journalists.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with the social media news cycle, they're not necessarily professional. And a lot of times they have an agenda. And they're trying to shape perceptions and not necessarily in appropriate or healthy ways.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's the part of the danger of social media as it relates to crisis is its ability to shape perceptions in a fashion that could increase the traumatizing potential of an event.
And
By the way,
how-
there is really clear evidence that has already happened if you look at the most recent youth risk behavior surveillance data.
Oh, really? What did
Yeah.
it say?
Okay, so you're all familiar with the YRBS. It's a biannual survey.
Out of Michigan?
I don't know where it's at, but I
Michigan
know
does the drug
CDC.
survey, I think.
It's
So,
basically, but it deals with a whole host of risky youth behaviors. And among them are indicators of school violence.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been doing this since 1991. A number of these questions have been asked for many years. If you look at the school violence indicators, by and large, most of them have a downward trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, schools are safer today than they were in 1991
Right.
by objective measures. However, one of the questions asks, to what extent have you skipped school a day or more in the past year? I'm paraphrasing. That might
Right.
not be the exact wording, but you get the gist. Have you skipped school because you were afraid?
Mm-hmm.
That's gone up.
Wow.
So despite the fact that all other measures of school violence are going down, the percentage of kids saying they've skipped school because they were afraid has gone up. And I'm wondering, could that be a consequence of the incredible exposure to traumatizing scenes and images?
Mm-hmm.
School-associated violent acts like what happened last year at Parkland.
Right.
Has that exposure been so pervasively spread around the society that it's changed threat perceptions?
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, kids are now worried about being shot at school.
Well, it goes to the phenomenon, what they call it, the mean world syndrome that developed. It was something that they talk about way back. It was if you just watch, say, TV news or local news for all of your feeds, that you begin to have an association that it's a mean world out there.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
Exactly.
that was back when there was just TV exposure to like local news. And, of course, they always would have the alarming headlines, what could kill you in your sink, tune in next. And you became afraid of most everything. And now you have these Facebook and Instagram and things that talk about these issues, as you were saying, in a more pervasive way. And how do we get a 10-year-old who, from a developmental standpoint, really isn't ready to critically assess material and how it can be manipulated? Because we've basically tried to present them the unfiltered curriculum. They're used to just taking at what I'm presented, that's the truth, and not being ready yet for that higher level of thinking, that critical thinking. And yet we know that a majority of middle schoolers and even quite a few later elementary students have their own smartphones and are readily accessing that. And most schools now are even encouraging kids to bring those devices to school to some degree.
Yeah.
And so... And they've frankly given up in trying to be able to filter, because when you have a smartphone, if you got a cell coverage, there's no filtering. It's your own device. And so you really have a lot of that going on. Now, most kids aren't trolling news sites for traumatic injuries, but they're certainly looking at videos and other things that can expose them to content and images that can definitely shape their attitudes.
Yeah.
And another thing I want to bring up that's a little departure from what we've been discussing, and we talked a little bit before going on air, is really getting away from kind of the idea of social media usage limits and more the way that people are using the social media. So talking about a little bit about, say, the people who are using social media to reach out and connect to existing social relationships like you talked about as the positive, and then kind of the opposite of the viewer or almost the voyeur, the one that's just cruising and looking at content and not really contributing and not really reaching out to content. And do you have any idea of when that type of distinction should be made to kids? Like when should you start talking about a way to use? You talked about a tool of social media. So what would be a good way to use social media that we would want to tell kids about? Or is that a tough one for you?
Actually, I want to know what you think.
Oh, well,
that.
I mean, I can, yeah, I mean, I think that's a difficult call because, once again, I think developmentally, depending on how young you get it, it makes it a little harder. But you and I have been talking about, and it gets a little apart from crisis response, but the increasing loneliness that we're seeing trending in our adolescence, and some of that is
increasing rates of depression, in particular severe depression among girls, resulting in hospitalization.
Right, and of course, I'm sure magnifying effect of any crisis that is there.
Yeah.
Because we talked in a past podcast how the contagion and the witnessing things and the underlying suicide attempts of underlying mental illness, and of course now we have so many more that have that mental illness, and some of that, at least there's certainly speculation that it's a social media response to that. Now, I will not leap on and say that's absolutely the cause, because as we know with any real world type of investigation, it's a complex picture out there, and isolate it to any one particular.
Totally agree.
Yeah, you really can't. But it's hard to argue with the data, and
it accounts for some of the variance.
You would think so.
How much?
Yeah, the correlation does not mean causation. You don't want to say, maybe there's something in the water we're drinking. Well, we know that there's a lot in the water that we're drinking that could be negatively affecting things. But just almost intuitively, you do think social media is having some sort of negative effect. And I think the loneliness aspect, has gotten so pernicious that even places like England have tried to counteract it with a curriculum to try to address that. And I think it gets into this social media usage and the way we use that media.
Yeah. There have been some challenges in Great Britain. I was talking to a reporter recently who was interviewing me for a story about social media being used to facilitate suicide. People kind of encouraging each other to do it.
And occasionally you even hear about, the live video stream.
Yes.
There were a few stories that, though I haven't heard those stories. No, I don't mean that that's not happening, but it seems to, some of these things tend to peak and then they tend to decline from the public view, usually because it's been replaced by some more immediate traumatic kind of experience. But I do remember recalling, especially when Facebook Live first went online, there was a lot of those incidents where people would actively show things that were going on, and some of those were the suicide attempts and things. And of course, then you have the power of the anonymity or perceived anonymity. So something I talk a lot about in my cyberbullying presentations is why are things so nasty? I'm like, well, if you don't think you're going to be held personally responsible for your comments, then you're more inclined to say whatever that deep, dark thing is.
I think an analogy a lot of adults can relate to is road rage. When you're in your car and, isolated from the world, and somebody cuts you off,
yeah.
I will say some things that I would never say.
Well, you may even do some things in the car, right?
Well, not me.
Not you.
Not
of
me.
course not.
Maybe you, damn it. Not me.
Well, yeah, totally.
But I think that's a good sort of analogy for adults to kind of get the sense of how this cyberbullying takes place. The anonymity of the car somehow frees you to be horrible and ugly?
Well, I mean, I think we all have some deep, dark impulses of immediate reactions when we have certain things happen to us, so that, maybe we fantasize about, but most of us, especially that have some social regulation, decide to just keep that to ourselves and then move on. And, usually you go on and move on quite quickly, but when you have the power to really quickly type out in an automatic way, like the kids pretty much have the ability to text and write their messages without hardly any thought.
Yeah.
And then you send it out, you've immediately gone ahead and already broadcast
Right.
it before it's retrievable.
Right.
And then people just feed in on that. And so, we certainly, with crisis response, have that kind of going into effect.
Yeah, like with the car, you have to get out of your car for it to be in public display.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time, by the time you do that, you've been able to regain your emotions. With the smartphone, and you're texting something or posting something to social media in the heat of the moment because nobody's around and I can do this,
Right.
then it's out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So do you have any sort of timeline regarding the history or the amount of social media? Has there been a point in this century
Mm-hmm.
where, because I know Facebook's not all that old.
No, it's about.
Was there a point where all of a sudden you can just see the trend line jump up in terms of usage, particularly among school age?
Yeah, I think generally like 2010 to 2012 kind of range is where you begin to see it's not just a niche for the affluent. And I think what you also see is that social media, while popular prior to that point, there was a big device that was introduced around that time called the iPhone. That was readily available. And so what you did is you took away the landlockedness of having to have a computer open and to be able to be working on it. You had something on your hip or in your purse or wherever you might store but it's with you all the time. Mm-hmm. And so once again, what it did is erased barriers of being able to put something online. And so that certainly is where you saw a pretty steep increase of a lot of the media usage, social media usage.
That's really interesting because it was about, if you look at the suicide death rates,
Mm-hmm.
CDC has a very interactive database where you could look at cause of death as well as tracking over time suicide death rates. And I've done it. It goes all the way back to, I think, 1991, just like YRBS. And then you can go back even further, but with a different database. But anyway, if you look at suicide rates in the 90s, there was school violence.
Mm-hmm.
Suicides were way more common than they are today. And there was this horrible upward trend. And that's about the time that school-employed mental health professionals like us began to think, we do more than give tests.
Well, the crisis intervention team was put in place
and I think we did a really good job, not just us, but other mental health professionals. But we were part of it.
Yes, sure.
And throughout the first part of this century, you saw a pretty consistent and dramatic decline in suicide death rates. Around 2008, you see it starts creeping upwards. Now, initially, I was attributing that to the Great Recession that we went through. And, families were going through tough times, all sorts of foreclosures. And we saw this internationally as well with rates of suicide just jumping up all of a sudden. Well, that trend, that upward trend in suicide death rates has continued to this day. And so, originally speculating maybe it's related to the recession.
Right.
We've recovered from the recession. Times,
more than
at least financially, are pretty good.
Sure.
And that trend has continued. So my latest thinking, and that was the origin of my question, is it might be connected to mental health and its association with suicide.
And I think, one of the things to point out is, of course, we're not going to remove smartphones. They're, if anything, going to get smaller, more integrated, and we pretty much have them with us already. So I'm going to transition a little bit to another thing that we had been talking about, and that's the power of apps within the phone. Because obviously social media and the apps available there some advantages, definitely have some disadvantages. But I think the important thing as practitioners that we need to be aware of is that there are plenty of mental health apps that can be of great assistance to those that may be having some issues, and that school psychologists maybe need to be aware of some of those that could provide some opportunities for us to be able to connect closely with those individuals that we have concerns about, in addition to even having resources for ourselves, because I think you were telling me about one that the National Childhood Trauma Stress Network had come out with, something called Psychological First Aid Mobile. I'm not as aware of it, but
maybe this is one for your column.
Well, it very well might be. So, as I recall,
it's PFA, which stands for Psychological First Aid Mobile. PFA Mobile. So if you go to your app store, you can. It's a free app, and it basically talks about the core elements of psychological first aid. For those of your listeners that are familiar with the Prepare curriculum, it's complementary to the Prepare curriculum. We've definitely attended to the psychological first aid literature as we've developed that curriculum. And it talks about just generally about psychological first aid core actions. It provides a list of survivor stress reactions. There's actually a survivor needs forum. That's a part of it. And really important for us, provider self-care.
Right.
So part of the app talks about how you take care of yourself when you're taking care of others in times of crisis.
And so I think this is one of those ways of maybe reaching out and letting our listeners know about apps, because it can be intimidating if you go into the App Store and try to find certain apps.
That's one I would recommend.
Yeah, and I think that it sounds like it's got a good basis and everything.
Another one that's related to it that comes out of the University of Minnesota is called Psychological First Aid Tutorial. So that one is more teaching you about it, whereas PFA Mobile is more of a tool for you when you're in the heat of things.
Would you recommend that particular one for maybe teachers in the district, or is that more oriented towards professionals?
Yeah, the whole idea of psychological first aid, just as with medical first aid, is with training.
Right.
It's appropriate for anyone to provide it. So, I would not suggest. I would suggest that a school psychologist could pick up PFA Mobile and benefit from it immediately. Other educators who are not mental health professionals might need a little more guidance and support.
So it's a little more of a specialized app.
Yeah.
Though we do have plenty that can be used both with faculty and students. I know Steve had a considerable list of apps that get into meditation and appropriate type of meditation. I believe Calm is a very popular one.
Where these kind of things can be really helpful with crisis intervention is a lot of times the challenge generated by the traumatic event exposure is your emotions. The traumatic event activates stress mechanisms, which are really important for survival. Adrenaline, cortisol in dangerous situations, really, really important. But once the danger is past, we need to help children learn how to turn that stress mechanism off. To the extent they do that, and we give them skills to do that, that's where that concept of post-traumatic growth comes into play.
Sure.
They're developing skills
coping
for coping
skills
with stress. And there's a number of apps related to mindfulness that could help the student turn off that stress mechanism.
And I think that's a very important thing, because they can have a guide, then school psychologists might be able to talk them through it. Make sure, of course, they always have permission to download any apps, and make sure another piece of advice we always use with apps is, of course, use it yourself for a little while before you ever recommend it to anyone, because you don't want something to pop up that may be especially inappropriate for a child or adolescent, just depending on their age. But given all of that, and most of these meditation are not, they're good, they're well done. I think Calm is another one. I keep thinking of these because I've given.
There's one called Breathing Zone. Yeah, Calm is another
Headspace is another one.
Headspace, Breathe.
Breathe. Yeah. Almost all of them are self-evident in their names. And so,
But
that's
what they
one
do is they
approach.
give the kiddo a tool,
Right.
a way to deal with the problem. That's really what mental health crisis intervention is all about, helping to identify the problem generated by the stressful event. Sometimes there's multiple needs, and so you help the kiddo prioritize them. But to the extent one or more of these problems is my emotions, I'm having problems sleeping, I can't stop thinking about it,
The
giving
recurrent
them
thought.
techniques or tools to cope.
Another
could
one that-
facilitate post-traumatic growth.
In addition to the meditation that I would recommend is trying to find kind of a mood tracker type of apps. One is literally called Mood Tracker. There's another one that I recently used called Mood Panda, which does have a little bit of I have a couple issues with it, but I think can also be real useful. And actually, the Mood Panda will go ahead and link up with the Fitbit. And so the Fitbit will go ahead and also measure it from like eating habits, so the calories that somebody's consumed, the amount of steps that they've had, and it will even create graphs that juxtapose rough times versus good times. And so as far as, as a professional, and you have individuals or students who've been on social media a lot, if they also use some of these mood trackers, they can be very great assistance for their own self-monitoring. And then you can also go to the school psychologist every once in a while to check in on those sorts of behaviors and make sure to increase their awareness of the patterns they may have in their own lives about, when I'm feeling bad. Maybe they're feeling bad when it's in the evening, and then you ask things like, well, when do you go on social media? Oh, you use it all the time at night. Well, it looks like it's not particularly good for you at this point. Is there other ways that either you can use it or other activities that maybe don't trigger those sort of responses of like depression or anxiety or things like that?
Yeah, you're giving kids skills. You're helping them to learn how to cope.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that's not to say that social media doesn't have some very nice sites that are set up for that very reason too.
Yeah.
But because it can be a relatively unfiltered and not as curated as, say, an app might be, we always need to be a little bit cautious that it doesn't twist in a way that we don't anticipate and is not good for the child's mental health.
A good example of what you're talking about, which is a very helpful app, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for use by a school psychologist in a school setting, is an app called My3. And it's designed for people with suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
And My3 are the 3 people that you would contact.
Oh, okay.
That's the kind of thing that I would want some with more a clinical orientation to use. Simply put, school psychs aren't 24/7 resources.
Right.
And so there might be, but my point being, as I played around with the app, which I thought, oh, this is great, My3, and it's a great app, don't get me wrong. I'm just not sure it's appropriate for a school-employed mental health professional who works, 7-8 hours a day and has weekends off and summers off, because suicide's a 24/7 concern. And when I got into the app and appreciated what it was involving, and I thought, oh, this is great for the clinical psychologist who's going to be available 24/7.
Right. Yeah, the one doing the DBT therapy.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
all that sort of thing.
Exactly.
I think it's a good point, and I want to do note, even though I'm bullish on almost things technology and a lot of the promise they hold, that any school psychologist that's representing their school district, you probably don't want to go rogue and start introducing apps without, clearing it with the higher ups and also explain the rationale of why you think it might be a useful thing. And I would also, on the side of caution, always send a consent form home with parents to just say, this might be very helpful. If you have any questions, would love to talk to you about it. Maybe the child's been just having a rough period and you think the meditation and mindfulness might be very helpful. In my experience, most of the time parents are going to be very open to it, but I'm sure they appreciate to have that type of communication there. So
that actually gets back to something where we started this conversation was the idea that the school safety / crisis response team is always doing something.
Right.
And among the things they could be doing is reviewing apps that might prove useful. either in terms of preventing crises.
Mm-hmm.
We can introduce a universal mindfulness curriculum to the school and help kids to be more centered. Lots of good evidence that those kinds of activities increase hippocampal volume, which, as we all know, is important to memory and learning.
Right.
So they can be doing that all along. Oh, and then they can, instead of going rogue, as you were suggesting, they can identify as a group those apps that we think for our population might be a useful tool for us to use with our kids during crisis.
Well,
and absent, the stress of a crisis event in real time, pause, take a look at it, play around with it, use it yourself, and get a sense for whether or not this might work for our kids.
Well, I can even conceivably have them have a whole kind of rubric or kind of standard to follow. If a crisis occurs, here are several different tweets to the resources that we know the kids already have access to.
I think you're just outlining your next just a click away column there, Dan.
Well, I think, maybe so. Maybe I need to start writing it right now. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude this Dialogue podcast on that note. Please tune in again for future Dialogue podcasts available on the NAS website.